There are weirwood roots growing out of the walls all over Harrenhal, and we need to talk about it. We are also going to talk about Daemon's crazy weirwood dream that he had there, and how it compares to some of the weirwood magic that we see in the books, and how it's basically one of the best examples of weirwood magic that we've seen on the screen so far. But first, we have to talk about those roots growing out of the walls. We're going to try get to the bottom of how that could be happening, and what it could mean for Harrenhal and other magical locations across Westeros. Viewers of my channel will know why I find this so interesting, but basically I have speculated in the past that there are potentially weirwoods inside of the walls of many of the important magical structures all across Westeros. House of the Dragon focusing as much as it did on the white roots growing out of the walls of the ruined castle of Harrenhal has given a huge boost to this line of thinking, so today I want to go over all of the details, try and get everyone caught up on why I think this is important, and what it could possibly mean to have weirwoods inside of your giant magical castle's walls. So I'll be brief talking about these other locations so that we can focus on the excitement of what we just had revealed at Harrenhal, but basically if you've seen my How the Wall Was Built video on the channel, you'll know that I think that there are weirwoods inside of the wall, at the very least at the Night Fort and probably throughout the entire wall, and that these weirwoods are what actually creates the magical ward of the wall. We see this on full display with Bloodraven's cave in the far north. The cave can magically somehow keep out the undead and the others, and the entrance to the cave is passing between two weirwoods. So, when Bran is warging into Hodor and Hodor passes through those two weirwoods, Bran is ejected from Hodor. This is the only time that I can recall where something like this has happened. Bran is a very powerful warg, he wargs into Hodor a lot, but when Hodor passes across this barrier between the two weirwoods, Bran is kicked out and is thrown back into his own body. The only other thing close to this is when Jon has his warging ability cut off when he's on opposite sides of the wall from Ghost. So it would sort of imply that the same magic that is going on when you pass between these two weirwoods is going on with the wall, which is again why I sort of think it's the most likely option to think that the wall has weirwoods inside of it. The wall, of course, was said to be built by Brandon the Builder, and so then this also brings into question other locations that were built by Brandon the Builder, places like Winterfell and Storm's End. Storm's End also is shown to have a magically warded wall, in if not the same way, at least a very similar way to the wall. Melisandre needs to be smuggled inside the walls of Storm's End. She needs to get across the magical barrier before she can birth her shadow baby, because if she were to birth it outside of the walls, it wouldn't be able to get across that barrier. So, when you are told that Brandon the Builder apparently helped in the construction of Storm's End, and it seems to function in a similar way to these lines of weirwoods, well, it does kind of make you wonder if the really thick walls of Storm's End might potentially have a ring of weirwoods growing within them. The same question, of course, is asked about Winterfell. Is there weirwoods or weirwood roots growing throughout the walls of Winterfell? It has been described as a great stone tree, and it has situations where there are hallways that go up and down and curve in weird ways that don't make any sense if you were designing them as a building, unless potentially you were following the existence of a giant root structure that is built into Winterfell itself. There is also, of course, the fact that Winterfell has hot water pumped from the hot springs up through the walls and it warms the entire castle. We don't really know what kind of pump technology they have in Westeros, but considering this seems to be a pretty old feature of the castle that has allowed it to survive the winters over many, many years, and considering what we've just seen at Harrenhal with roots seemingly running through the entire structure, it really is worth asking the question. Might there be these weirwood roots running through the entire castle of Winterfell and pumping the water? Tree roots, after all, do pump water. So this is a question that has been asked many times by the fandom, and that's the context in which we're having this big discussion, and why we're all going to be so excited about seeing these weirwood roots breaking out of the walls of Harrenhal at this big magical castle. There are potentially some big implications to this idea being true, and a lot of fallout that could come from the fact that there are weirwoods inside of these castles, and it would make Harrenhal very similar to Bloodraven's cave if it did indeed have weirwoods in the walls and these roots running through the entire structure, just like Bloodraven's cave has weirwoods in the entranceway and has weirwood roots running through the entire cave system. For full details on that, I have a whole video about Bloodraven's Cave and how it's a magical tree town of the Children of the Forest, but basically the main point is that it does seem that passing between these two weirwoods is the thing that marks the barrier of this magical ward. And this makes a lot of sense to me. If you're going to have some sort of magical ward that can create a barrier, having it done between two weirwood trees just makes complete sense because the weirwood trees seem to be a sort of conduit for old gods' magic. So if you were going to build a magical ward, you would probably want a giant line of weirwood trees. We get a very good look at one of these weirwood trees inside of the wall at the Night Fort when Bran and company pass through the Black Gate, and I think it's pretty likely that this is a hint that there are just straight up weirwood trees growing within the wall. We even see something very similar to what we see at Harrenhal up in the kitchens of the Night Fort. There is a weirwood breaking out through the floor and growing there. This is basically exactly what we repeatedly see when Daemon arrives at Harrenhal. Daemon lands Caraxes on one of the top towers of Harrenhal, and then he's making his way down through the castle. And one of the first times that they cut away from Daemon, they have him just like walking through the background. What is the focus of the camera shot? It is focused on a root that is growing through the ruins of this castle. The Weirwood connection and the tree roots growing out of the walls of Harrenhal is one of the main things that they are really driving home about Harrenhal as a location. Even the shot where Daemon is flying in on Caraxes, one of the first things we see is the Isle of Faces out in the middle of the lake, and then Harrenhal is back in the distance as Daemon flies in, so that is a Weirwood connection right there. And of course, obviously, we'll get to the crazy Weirwood dream that Daemon eventually has, but I really just do want to point out that they take different camera shots and literally focus them on the roots of the Weirwood that are growing out of the walls. The other thing that I feel like is worth driving home is that this isn't just happening down on ground level near the Godswood and near the Weirwood that we see later on in the episode. We see Daemon land his dragon on the top of the castle, and then he's coming down the stairs and into these ruined halls that seem to be near the tops of these ruined towers. The castle of Harrenhal contains the ruins of 5 incredibly tall towers, and it has incredibly thick walls. It is also said that there are parts of the castle that have not been entered in decades, which would make sense. Just like the Night Fort, it hasn't been entered in decades. That's why these weirwood trees are able to be growing out through the walls and overtaking parts of the castle. The other little thing that sort of confirms that when we are seeing these weirwood roots, we are up in those tall towers that are abandoned, is the fact that we see a scene where a bunch of bats fly out. And one of the things about Harrenhal is it said that some of these old ruined towers have a bunch of bats living up in the top of them. So this all just comes together to say that yes, these scenes do take place up in the top towers of Harrenhal. These weirwood roots are overtaking even the tall towers of this castle. And let's remember that Harrenhal and its towers are one of the largest structures in all of Westeros. But for these roots, that's no problem. They are growing all throughout the walls of this castle, and they are breaking out of the walls anywhere that hasn't been upkept in the last several decades, much like what we see at the kitchens of the Night Fort. So that alone is pretty crazy. If we assume that the weirwood down in the Godswood is the source of these roots, that would mean that the weirwood roots are working their way up through the structure. But the other option is also pretty crazy. The idea that there are weirwoods besides the one in the Godswood that are actually inside the walls themselves. And we know there is weirwood inside of the walls of Harrenhal because many weirwoods were cut down and used as beams to build the castle, but we don't know that there are actually living weirwoods inside of the walls, but if there were, that would kind of explain why there are roots breaking out from them. Basically, no matter which way you go with this, it's a really cool situation. Either there are the weirwood roots from the tree down in the Godswood that have snaked their way up through the structure and they're breaking out through the walls, which has some crazy implications. Or there is the implication that potentially these beams that were cut down and used as building blocks of Harrenhal are somehow still alive. Could it be the fact that the beams of weirwood inside of the walls have not been fully killed somehow, and therefore are able to, like, propagate within the walls and essentially grow new roots, even though the trees themselves had been cut down? That would be pretty crazy if that's what's going on. Or are there potentially literally weirwood trees that were alive that were built into the structure of Harrenhal, and that's why we see these roots breaking out from all of the different walls? I'd love to hear down in the comments which of those options you think is the most likely for how the inside of the walls of Harrenhal look. Do you think that there are weirwood beams in there that are somehow growing roots out? Do you think that there are full-on weirwood trees in there that are growing roots out? Or do you view it as all like this giant web of roots that are all reaching out from that weirwood down in the godswood and just growing their way up through the walls? I don't necessarily have a super strong opinion as to how this is going at Harrenhal. I do think that the walls themselves are thick enough where the way that they are described, you could imagine that there is actually weirwood trees built into them. They are that thick, but I don't know if that's actually what we're meant to take from this, but it would make a lot of sense. It would certainly seem to make a little bit more sense than the idea that the beams themselves that were like used in construction would be growing roots. But again, if that is a thing that could happen with weirwood trees where like you cut them down into wooden beams and then they somehow still are able to stay alive, that would also be pretty cool. Basically, we don't know for sure, but I don't think we've ever seen any other example of like a dead, chopped down, turned into a structural beam type of weirwood actually growing roots and coming back alive. But I do think we may have seen other situations where there are living weirwood trees built into magical walls, so it would be very cool if that's what we're actually seeing here at Harrenhal. In any case, I am really, really glad that House of the Dragon decided to go with this detail of weirwood roots growing out from all of the walls. The other thing I'm really glad to see from this episode is how deep they went into the creepy weirwood dream magic with Daemon. Another thing that I've talked about on the channel quite a bit, it came up on the live stream that I did recently, I've talked about it in past videos, is how Game of Thrones on TV didn't go into full detail about a lot of the weirwood magic that is being built up in the books. We did get some of the basics, but that's really all we got. The weirwoods in the books are much creepier, much darker. People have entrails hung up in the weirwood trees. There's human sacrifice done to feed the old gods via the weirwood trees. It's all very dark and creepy, which lines up very well with the fact that the weirwood trees often also send very dark and creepy dreams. The best example, I think, from the books that is closest to what we see here with Daemon is what happens when Jaime Lannister sleeps with his head on a weirwood stump and has a crazy dream about being deep down in the depths of Casterly Rock. Jamie is confronted by many people who are dead, many things that haunt him in his life. He is confronted by Rhaegar and his former Kingsguard brothers. He has to defend his actions to them around the slaying of the Mad King, and they talk about how they had all sworn oaths to protect him, and Jamie is basically threatening to fight them all at once. You can tell that the defense of his own actions to these people who he once respected very deeply is something that he never got to do and is something that haunts him to this day. It is a deep part of his psyche that is there haunting him, which is very similar to how Daemon is probably feeling when he sees a young Rhaenyra sewing the head back onto Jaehaerys. He is sort of seeing the version of Rhaenyra that he fell in love with, having to clean up the mess of Daemon's own actions, and this is something that is haunting him obviously after his fight that he just got into with Rhaenyra. You can very clearly see how much this bothers Daemon, and then all of a sudden when he drops his sword, he wakes up and realizes that he hadn't been walking through the halls of Harrenhal. He had actually sleepwalked all the way out to the Godswood and is now staring into the face of the weirwood tree. If all of the other creepy shots of the weirwood and all of the roots breaking out through the walls everywhere in Harrenhal wasn't enough evidence, this is making it very clear that this dream comes directly from the weirwood. I'm really glad that House of the Dragon has decided to go in this direction. With the way that the later seasons of Game of Thrones, as I said, just sort of ignored a lot of the weirwood magic and didn't establish a lot of it, I could have seen House of the Dragon doing a similar thing where they sort of downplayed it, and the old gods had taken a little bit of a back seat. Now that we've had our first look at Harrenhal, I think it's safe to say that this is not the case. The weirwoods, the old gods, and all of the coolest world building and lore and magic in Westeros is going to be something that is put more front and center by this series compared to the previous one, and for that I am very grateful. Also, to be completely honest, as the guy who has talked a lot about there being weirwoods inside of walls previously, I really couldn't have asked for anything better than a bunch of weirwood roots breaking out from the walls of Harrenhal's tallest towers. That is something that I think is really exciting, and I can't wait to hear what you guys think of it down in the comments. If there are living weirwoods within the walls of Harrenhal and within the wall and potentially inside of Winterfell and Storm's End, then it sort of paints the construction and the destruction of Harrenhal in a very different light. It would imply that Harren the Black, on some level or another, knew what he was doing magically. He was trying to create a third great warded structure, sort of like Winterfell and Storm's End, another castle to rule from that is magically protected by the same type of magic, and he is tapping into some Brand the Builder type of stuff if that is indeed what's happening, and he's doing it for apparently the first time in thousands of years. Living weirwoods within the wall would definitely put Harren the Black on like that Brand the Builder level of construction. Whether he did that or not, I don't know if we know for sure, but it is something that could be implied by this episode. If that is the case, and Black Heron created a similarly warded structure and then it was instantly destroyed by dragons, that would kind of set dragons up as a foil to this warded Weirwood magic, and if it goes at all like what we saw in the television show where one of the dragons ends up burning down the wall, this could kind of be a little bit of setup for that. Obviously, this episode has given us a ton of stuff to think about, and this is stuff that I'll definitely be covering in the future, and we'll have to be keeping an eye out for more clues in the coming episodes. The other thing that I wanted to get people's opinions on in the comments really quickly was the artwork on the back of the chair in Harrenhal. In that dining hall scene, we got a brief look at the back of the guy's chair, and on there was an image of what looks to be some sort of knight or some sort of figure, sitting on what could be an oaken or weirwood throne. The image will be on your screen right now, and you can sort of see how behind the guy there are those branches sticking up in sort of the way that you would have swords sticking up if you were sitting on the Iron Throne, and there's a lot of imagery in the world building and the lore about green men sitting on ancient oaken thrones or weirwood thrones, what have you. There is the oaken seat, which was the seat of the kings of the Reach, and it was supposed to be a living throne planted by Garth the Green himself, so, being so close to the Isle of Faces where the Green Men are supposed to live, and you have this artwork of someone potentially sitting on a living throne like that, I just thought it was really interesting and worth bringing up, and I figured I'd point it out so that if any of you down in the comments had any good thoughts or anything to add to that, you could do so. I'm sure that we'll be seeing plenty more of Harrenhal, and so there will be plenty more little details like this that are dropped, so this is something that we're definitely going to be talking about again on the channel, but for today I had to get out a quick reaction to all of the weirwood roots that were growing out of the walls. If you haven't seen my previous videos about trees and walls or Bloodraven's Cave or things like that, check out some of the end cards here at the end of your video, and make sure to hit that like and subscribe button before you go. As I said, there's going to be plenty more to talk about and you're not going to want to miss it. And with that, thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back with something else very soon.